Treasury Secretary Jack Lew sat down with me exclusively yesterday to touch on a wide range of topics, including his replacement, Steven Mnuchin, the makeup of the Trump cabinet, and President Obama's pledge for a smooth transition to President-elect Donald Trump. First, he explained to me why corporate and individual tax reform was not achievable on his watch.
Let's separate business tax reform from individual tax reform. I think we actually made a lot of progress on my watch on business tax reform. There's a fairly broad consensus that the way we should reform our business tax system is to eliminate the loopholes and the deductions that make the system so lopsided. We have the highest statutory rate in the developed world, but our average rate is on par with most countries in Europe. The difference is we need to get rid of the loopholes of the deductions, and we need to lower the rates. But what we can't do is spend a lot of money having a tax cut that loses revenue, because that's just going to shift the burden somewhere else. Why couldn't we get it done? You know, the politics have been challenging in the last few years. I think that there was more of a consensus around ideas than there was about getting something done. You have to want to get something done. You have to want to do it together. I think there were some in Congress who were just as happy not to have a big accomplishment on something like a business tax cut during this administration, but that didn't stop us from pursuing it quite aggressively. And I had many, many conversations with now Speaker Paul Ryan, with senators like Rob Portman and Chuck Schumer, and I've believed for 2 years now that if there was a decision to get business tax reform done, it could be done in a way that closes the loopholes, that lowers the rates, and that shuts down the pressure that's forcing companies to make these terrible decisions to invert and to leave the country to pay taxes in another system, even though they're still benefiting from all the investments we've made here in the United States. I think that we need to close that opportunity down, so we've done that through regulatory moves to make it harder, but the only way to really fix it is to reform our tax system. I think we've gotten more than halfway there. On the individual side, it's more complicated because it's tied to fiscal policy so fundamentally. There is no revenue-neutral way to cut individual taxes unless you reduce deductions on things like charitable contributions and mortgage interest deductions that either it's a policy problem or a political problem. And I think that the challenge has to be, can you contain some of the deductions and lower rates and still raise additional revenue to close the fiscal gap that we have in the future? I suspect the environment in Washington won't be focused so much on the fiscal gap for the next few months, but it's really important that we keep our eye on that, because if you open a big fiscal gap, the only way to close it is to cut spending or to raise taxes. And if you cut spending, you're going to be looking at things like Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food assistance programs like SNAP, and that's a real problem because that serves important needs in the lives of working families.
Do you think this experiment of rolling back regulations and lowering taxes, including taxes for those companies that are keeping all that money overseas, do you think they're going to bring it here? Will this work?
I think that there are ways to make it much more likely that that money will come home, but only if you make it mandatory that it be taxed, not if it's voluntary. If it's voluntary, we've seen in the past that companies will only bring it back at the moment when they most benefit, not at the moment when it lends additional revenue to the overall system. We saw that in the early 2000s. I think that the idea that you cut regulations and you unleash enormous growth in the economy, I don't think it's supported by the analysis that I've seen of most of the regulatory proposals. I think you also have to look at what you're doing when you reverse regulations. If you create a greater risk of financial instability, that has a cost. If you create a greater risk in terms of the health of children because of the air they breathe, or workers losing productive days because they have health problems or their kids have health problems, we've seen that the cost benefit of these things is net positive for doing the things we've done. So I personally do not think the analysis that shows some enormous burgeoning income and revenue will materialize.